The cameras were already flashing when it happened. Outside the glass doors of the most prestigious auction house in the city, where money moved like air and the elite arrived in vehicles worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, something stopped everyone cold. Not a celebrity, not a scene, not an argument or announcement. It was a limousine, but not just any limousine. This one was gold-plated from bumper to bumper, long and slow and completely silent as it curved through the circular driveway, its windows so dark they seemed to hold secrets inside them like a vault. The crowd on the steps parted without being told to. Even the security guards straightened without instruction. Cameras swung away from the entrance and aimed at the car as if pulled by an invisible hand. Mateo Vega stood near the top of those steps in a tailored charcoal suit he could barely afford, with his arm loosely around the waist of a woman draped in diamonds, and even he turned to look. He always turned to look at wealth. It was the one reflex he never managed to control. He watched the limousine idle. He watched the driver step out first, move to the rear door and stand at attention. He watched the door open. And then he heard himself whisper, low enough that only the woman beside him could hear it. "That is the richest man in the world. Everyone knows that car. Everyone knows that man. But who is the woman beside him?" He shook his head slowly. "She looks like a queen." The woman beside him, Marisol Fuentes, smiled without looking, already bored by anything that was not about her. But Mateo could not look away. Something about the woman stepping out of that limousine nagged at him, pulled at the edge of a memory he had folded up and buried a long time ago. He squinted through the camera flashes and the noise and the crowd that was now surging forward, and then his face changed completely. He knew those shoulders. He knew that walk. Slow, unhurried, certain. He knew the way she held her chin, not raised with arrogance but lifted with a quiet kind of dignity that had always made him feel vaguely uncomfortable without knowing why. His throat tightened. His hand dropped from Marisol's waist. That was Catalina, his ex-wife, the woman he had called ordinary, the woman he had left behind in a diner on a Tuesday morning with nothing but an envelope and an apology he had not really meant. Catalina. Standing beside the wealthiest man on the planet, wearing something that caught the light like liquid metal, composed and radiant and completely, devastatingly unbothered. But to understand why that moment hit Mateo like a collision, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Catalina was before the world got the chance to see her properly. Catalina Reyes had never described herself as extraordinary. She was the kind of woman who moved through life with quiet intention, the kind of person who kept a household budget in a leather notebook and actually followed it, who cooked from scratch not because she had to, but because she believed that care showed up in small acts. She was warm and precise and deeply loyal, and before she married Mateo Vega, she had been known in her neighborhood for her effortless elegance, her sharp mind, and the way she could walk into a room and make every person in it feel genuinely seen. She had dreamed once of starting a literacy foundation, of building something that mattered, of using the inheritance her late mother had left her, which was mostly a piece of land on the edge of the city that nobody seemed to think much of, to create something lasting and good. Her mother had pressed the deed into her hands the week before she passed and told her, "The ground beneath your feet is never empty, Mija. Trust what is yours." Catalina had held those words the way people hold things that do not yet make sense but feel too important to let go of. Then she married Mateo. Mateo was charming in the way that certain fires are charming. Bright, warm, and capable of consuming everything around them if left unattended. He spoke about investments and opportunities, and the future with such confidence that Catalina believed him the way she had believed her mother, completely and without reservation. She stopped wearing the clothes she loved because Mateo told her that a serious wife did not dress for attention. She stopped dreaming out loud about her foundation because Mateo told her that ambition without capital was just noise. She clipped coupons, stretched every coin, kept the household running on almost nothing while Mateo moved money around in ways he never fully explained. She told herself it was love. She told herself that sacrifice was what partnership looked like from the inside. What she did not know was that Matteo had known about the land from the beginning. He had quietly commissioned a private geological assessment 2 years into their marriage, and when the preliminary results hinted at something significant beneath the soil, he had buried the report and said nothing. He had kept Catalina small and financially dependent on purpose, moving their savings gradually, quietly, into accounts she could not easily access, waiting until the moment was right to take everything and leave. He had simply found a reason to leave sooner than planned. That reason was Marisol Fuentes. Marisol arrived in Mateo's life at a corporate event where she glittered under chandelier light and spoke about luxury properties and international connections, and a lifestyle so elevated it seemed to float above ordinary consequence. Mateo looked at her and saw everything he had convinced himself he deserved. He did not look closely enough to see the performance underneath the performance. On a gray Tuesday morning, he walked into a roadside diner where the plastic menus were laminated and the coffee came in paper cups, and he sat across from Catalina and slid a manila envelope across the table. Divorce papers. Then he slid a second item beside them, a creased, yellowed land deed. Her mother's land. The thing he had spent years calculating how to take. He said it almost gently. Take the land. It is worthless anyway. You might as well keep something. Catalina did not cry. She picked up the deed with both hands and held it carefully, the way her mother had taught her to hold things that mattered. She signed what needed to be signed. She stood. She walked out of that diner without looking back at Mateo, without glancing through the window at the woman idling in the rented sports car outside, without giving him the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. That night she sat alone in her sister's spare room with the deed in her lap and the silence pressing in from every wall, and she heard her mother's voice as clearly as if the woman were sitting beside her. The ground beneath your feet is never empty, Mija. She did not know yet what those words meant, but she held them anyway. And she did not let go. 3 weeks after Catalina signed those divorce papers, a letter arrived at her sister's apartment. It was not a bill. It was not a court document. It was printed on thick cream paper with an embossed letterhead she did not recognize, and it was addressed to her by full name, which surprised her because very few people knew where she was staying. The letter came from a geological survey firm, and it was brief and professional and so quietly monumental that she had to read it 4 times before the words stopped rearranging themselves on the page. The firm had been commissioned by a private investment group to conduct a comprehensive assessment of land parcels on the eastern edge of the city. Her parcel, the one her mother had left her, the one Mateo had called worthless as he slid it across a laminated diner table like a piece of junk mail, had come back with results that the letter described, in the careful language of people trained not to use emotional words, as a discovery of exceptional and historic significance. The land sat directly above the largest untapped lithium reserve ever recorded in the region, possibly in the world. Catalina set the letter down on the kitchen table. She looked out the window at the narrow street below, at the ordinary morning happening outside, pigeons and passing cars and a child on a bicycle, and she thought about her mother pressing that deed into her hands. She thought about the word worthless said in Mateo's voice with Mateo's half-smile. She thought about how a man could look at something every day and never once understand what he was looking at. Then she picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom of the letter. What followed was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet the way the most consequential things in life often are. Meetings in private offices. Documents reviewed by lawyers her sister helped her find. Assessments confirmed by a second firm and then a third. Every report said the same thing in different technical language. What sat beneath that stretch of land was not just valuable. It was generational. It was the kind of discovery that rewrote maps and shifted markets and made governments pay attention. Catalina listened carefully in every meeting, asked precise questions, took notes in the same leather notebook she had used to track household budgets for years, and said very little to anyone outside those rooms. She had learned the cost of speaking too soon. She had learned it in a marriage. While Catalina moved in careful, deliberate silence, Mateo and Marisol were moving in the opposite direction entirely. From the outside, they looked like a couple ascending. Marisol posted photographs of penthouse terraces and private dining rooms and weekend getaways to resorts where rooms cost more per night than most people earned in a month. She wore different jewelry in every photograph and spoke at public events about her portfolio and her properties, and the investments she was nurturing across 3 continents. Mateo stood beside her in every image looking like a man who had finally arrived at the life he always believed he was owed. But behind that performance, the machinery was grinding badly. What Mateo did not know, and what he had been too dazzled to investigate before throwing his marriage away, was that Marisol Fuentes owned almost nothing she presented to the world. The penthouse was leased month to month, and the payment was already overdue. The jewelry was borrowed from a boutique that extended credit to socialites in exchange for visibility at high-profile events. The resort photographs were taken during a single 4-day trip funded by a credit card that was now sitting at 89% of its limit. The properties she spoke about so fluently at those public events existed only in the presentations of deals she had not yet closed and would likely never close, because Marisol's actual expertise was not in business. It was in reading people. It was in identifying men like Mateo, men who wanted to believe they had won something rare, and letting them fund the illusion of her success while they called it a relationship. The money Mateo had quietly moved out of his and Catalina's shared accounts over the years, money he had extracted slowly and carefully so that Catalina would not notice, was disappearing faster than even he had anticipated. Marisol's lifestyle had a metabolism that no ordinary income could sustain. He was beginning to feel the pressure but could not say so out loud, because admitting financial strain to Marisol would have meant admitting that he was not the man she believed him to be, and that was a truth he could not afford in any sense of the word. Neither of them knew that across the city, the woman they had discarded was sitting in a law firm conference room signing agreements that would make every dollar they had ever spent together look like loose change found in a coat pocket. And neither of them knew about Alejandro. Alejandro Rios did not announce himself. He never had. That was one of the things that separated genuinely powerful people from people who only played at power, and Alejandro had understood that distinction from a very young age, in part because he had spent a significant portion of his youth with nothing at all. He had grown up on ambition alone, sharp-minded and disciplined, the kind of young man who studied by streetlight when the electricity was cut, and still showed up to every examination prepared. He had won a partial scholarship to a university program in engineering and technology, but had arrived at registration to find that the remaining tuition balance was more than his family could cover, more than any arrangement he had made could accommodate. He had sat outside the registrar's office for 2 hours, working through every option he could think of, and found none. It was Catalina who had approached him. She did not know him. She had simply seen a young man sitting very still with the expression of someone doing mathematics that kept returning the wrong answer. She had asked him one question. She had listened to his answer. And then she had gone to the bank that afternoon and transferred every peso she had saved privately over 6 months, money she had set aside in a small account Mateo did not monitor, into a payment that covered the outstanding balance and left Alejandro Rios enrolled. She had told him only her first name. She had asked for nothing. She had said, quietly and without drama, that she believed the world needed people who thought the way he thought, and that she was simply making sure it got the chance to find out. Alejandro had spent the next decade making sure that investment was not wasted. He built his first company from a dormitory room, then a second from a rented office, then a third that rewrote the architecture of global technology infrastructure in ways that made him a name spoken in boardrooms on every continent. By the time he was looking for Catalina, which he had been doing quietly and persistently for months through a private investigator his firm retained, he was worth more than most countries could calculate comfortably. He had never forgotten her name. He had never forgotten what she did or why she said she did it. And when he found her, sitting in a modest apartment with a geological report in her hands and a future that was just beginning to reveal its true size. He had known before he knocked on the door exactly what he was going to say. He told her he had been looking for her for a long time. He told her what she had made possible with that single quiet act of generosity. He told her that he had built something extraordinary and that he wanted her to be part of it, not as an obligation, not as repayment, but as a genuine partner in every sense, because he had spent years surrounded by people who wanted access to his wealth and had never once met someone who had given from their own pocket without expecting anything in return. He told her she was the standard by which he had measured every person who entered his life since that afternoon outside the registrar's office. Catalina had listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment with the calm, measuring gaze of a woman who had learned not to make decisions quickly. Then she said that she needed a few days to think. She took 4. Their wedding was small. A garden, close family, no announcements, no press. She wore something simple and ivory and carried a single flower her sister had cut from the yard that morning. Alejandro wore a dark suit and looked at her the way people look at things they almost lost before they understood their value. The honeymoon was brief because both of them had work to attend to, and both of them preferred it that way. On the morning their return flight landed, Alejandro's assistant placed a printed invitation on the car seat between them. A high-stakes charity auction at the city's most prestigious venue, the kind of event attended by the financial elite, the kind of event where people went to be seen as much as to spend. Alejandro glanced at the invitation and then looked at Catalina. She was reading something on her phone, composed and unhurried, the morning light catching the angles of her face. He asked if she had seen the guest list. She said she had. He straightened his jacket and looked out the window at the city moving past them. He said that if she wanted to attend, he would make whatever arrangements were needed. She set her phone down and looked at him with a small, certain smile. The kind of smile that does not need to explain itself. She said she thought they should go. She said it was time. That evening, they stepped into a gold-plated limousine that moved through the city like a quiet declaration, and Catalina sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing silk the color of moonlight, and she looked perfectly calm in the way that only someone who has already won can afford to look. The gold-plated limousine came to a complete stop, and for a moment the entire front of the auction house held its breath. There was no dramatic music. There was no announcement. There was only the soft mechanical sound of the rear door opening, and then the sight of a woman stepping out onto the stone driveway with the unhurried ease of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to enjoy. Catalina Rios, formerly Catalina Vega, formerly the woman a man had called ordinary and left behind in a roadside diner, stood in the open air of that evening wearing a gown the color of liquid silver, cut simply and perfectly, catching the light with every breath she took. Her hair was swept back. Her jewelry was understated and real. She did not look around to see who was watching. She did not need to. She already knew. The paparazzi moved first. That was always the truest measure of a room, not the applause or the whispers, but where the cameras pointed when something more compelling than the planned story walked through the door. One turned, then 3, then all of them, swinging away from the entrance where Marisol Fuentes had been holding court in a strapless gown and borrowed diamonds, smiling the practiced smile of a woman accustomed to being the most photographed person at any gathering. The cameras left her mid-pose. They did not return. Marisol's smile stayed on her face for a moment longer than her actual feeling did. That small delay, that fraction of a second between the expression and the reality behind it, told everyone watching closely exactly what she was experiencing. She turned to see what had stolen her moment and went completely still. Alejandro Rios stepped out of the limousine behind his wife, buttoned his jacket with one hand, and offered Catalina his arm with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with where he stood in the world. He was not the loudest presence in that driveway. He did not need to be. His name alone, recognized immediately by every financial journalist and society photographer in the crowd, was sufficient. But it was Catalina beside him who commanded the space. It was Catalina the cameras could not stop finding. There was something about her composure, about the quality of her stillness, that made the diamonds Marisol wore look suddenly like costume pieces, and made the borrowed elegance of the entire evening feel slightly less convincing. Mateo Vega had not moved from the top of the steps. He was gripping the iron railing without realizing he was doing it. The face he was wearing was not anger and it was not grief. It was the specific expression of a man encountering the full consequence of a decision he had made while believing he was too clever to face consequences. He watched his ex-wife walk toward the entrance of that building, and he could not reconcile the woman he saw with the version of her he had kept in his memory, quiet, compliant, grateful for whatever he allowed her to have. That woman and this woman did not match. They did not even belong in the same sentence. Catalina walked past him. She did not slow down. She did not look at him the way people look when they want to be noticed looking away. She simply moved forward with Alejandro at her side, exchanging a quiet word with him that made her smile genuinely, and she went inside. The auction hall was precisely the kind of room that believed money was the only language worth speaking. High ceilings, crystal lighting, rows of padded chairs filling fast with people whose net worth had been vetted before they were issued a bidding number. The items on offer that evening ranged from rare estate properties to private art collections to commercial acquisitions worth hundreds of millions. It was the kind of room where Marisol Fuentes had always felt safest, because in rooms like this one, performance was mistaken for substance regularly enough that she had built an entire life on the confusion. She swept inside minutes after Catalina's entrance, recalibrated and smiling again, pulling Mateo with her toward their reserved seats near the front. She was going to bid tonight. She had announced it to several people already. She was going to demonstrate, publicly and definitively, that she belonged at the very top of this room. She had rehearsed this evening in her mind for weeks. It was going to be her moment. The auction opened. The first several lots moved quickly, numbers climbing with the practiced rhythm of an auctioneer who understood packing. The crowd was engaged and flush and competitive. Marisol watched the early rounds with visible impatience, waiting for the lots that mattered, the ones that would let her perform at the scale she had advertised to everyone she knew. When the first of those lots opened, she raised her paddle without hesitation. The number climbed. She raised it again. The room watched with the particular attention it reserves for people who bid like they have something to establish rather than something to buy. She pushed the price high, higher than was sensible, and she wore the expression of someone for whom sensible was an insult. Then the auctioneer asked for confirmation of her registration to proceed at that level, a standard procedural step for bids crossing a certain threshold, and the room waited while his assistant leaned in and delivered a quiet word that the auctioneer received with the professional neutrality of a man trained to absorb surprising information without changing his face. He looked at Marisol. He said, with genuine courtesy and genuine finality, that he was sorry, but her card on file had been declined and she would need to provide an alternate method of payment to continue. The room absorbed this in absolute silence. Marisol said it was a banking error. She said it with the correct tone and the correct expression, and she even produced her phone as if she were about to solve the problem from her seat. But the silence in that room had a different quality now. It was the silence of people who had suspected something and were watching it confirm itself in real time. Mateo sat beside her without speaking. His face had gone the color of old paper. Then Alejandro Rios rose from his seat. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and spoke in the calm and measured tone of a man accustomed to rooms that listened when he opened his mouth. He said that before the evening continued, he wanted to share a brief piece of information that was relevant to several people present. He said that his company had finalized the acquisition of the financial institution that held the primary accounts and outstanding debt obligations of several parties in this room. The acquisition had been completed that morning. The paperwork was in order. He would be happy to share documentation with anyone who wished to review it. He paused. He let that settle. Then he said that as a personal matter, unrelated to business, he would like to purchase the building in which they were all currently sitting. The entire property, full market value, payment to be transferred before midnight. He said he intended to gift it to his wife, Catalina Rios, for purposes she would announce in due course. He sat back down. The room did not erupt immediately. It took a breath first, the way rooms do when something genuinely unexpected has occurred, and the people inside it need a moment to recalibrate their understanding of the evening. Then it began, murmurs spreading outward from the center like ripples, chairs shifting, phones appearing, the auctioneer consulting urgently with his superior at the side of the room. Marisol stood up. She said something sharp and brittle that the people nearest her heard but would later describe differently depending on who was asked. She looked around the room for support and found only the careful, averted eyes of people who had attended enough of these evenings to know which direction the power in this room had moved, and who had no interest in being associated with the side that had just lost. Mateo said her name quietly. She did not respond. She was already calculating, already running through the list of contacts and favors and connections she had spent years constructing, trying to locate the exit from this moment. But the exits were closing. The bank that held her line of credit was no longer operated by people she had lunched with and cultivated carefully over time. The debt that she and Mateo had accumulated through months of performance and overspending was now held by a company whose owner was seated 12 rows away with his hand resting quietly over his wife's. 2 members of the venue's security staff appeared at Marisol's elbow. They were polite. They were immovable. They explained in low, professional voices that the current ownership of the property required her to vacate the premises, and that any questions regarding her accounts should be directed to the relevant financial offices beginning the following business day. Marisol left the room the way people leave rooms when they have no choice but have not yet accepted it, walking too quickly and holding themselves too rigidly and looking at no one. Mateo followed her because there was nothing else left for him to do. In the corridor outside the hall, as the noise of the auction resumed behind them and the world inside continued without pause, Mateo stopped. He stood very still for a moment. And then he turned back toward the door, not to re-enter, but simply because some part of him needed to look one more time at the room that had just rearranged his life. Through the small rectangular window in the door, he could see Catalina. She was speaking to the auctioneer now. Composed and direct, gesturing once toward the front of the room with the authority of someone who already knew the shape of her plans. She did not glance toward the door. She did not glance toward where he was standing. She did not know he was there, and if she had, it would not have changed her expression at all. He turned away and walked down the corridor after Marisol, and the door closed behind him without a sound. Inside the hall, Catalina finalized the transfer of the building with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Her lawyers were present. The documentation was in order. Alejandro sat beside her and signed where he was required to sign, and said very little because Catalina needed very few words to move through a room. When the formal portion was concluded, she thanked the auctioneer and stood and looked at the space around her with the measured gaze of a woman already seeing what it would become. In the weeks that followed, she announced the establishment of the Mija Foundation, named for a word her mother had spoken to her at every turning point in her life. The foundation was built on 3 pillars: financial education and independence for women navigating circumstances like the one she had survived, literacy programs for children in underserved communities, honoring the dream she had set aside during her marriage and picked back up again the moment she was free, and scholarship funding for young people with the intelligence and discipline to build extraordinary things, but without the resources to begin, a pillar whose origins she described in the Foundation's first public statement with a brevity that said everything. Because someone once believed in what a young mind could become. This is what that belief looked like in return. The first building in the Foundation's network was constructed on her family's land, on the ground above the lithium reserve, in a section left deliberately unexcavated, preserved and green, with her mother's name carved into the stone beside the entrance. The first scholarship was named for her mother as well. The announcement drew coverage from publications on 5 continents, not because of Alejandro's wealth, though that was noted, but because of Catalina's story, which spread the way stories spread when they are genuinely true. Marisol Fuentes disappeared from the public spaces she had occupied so visibly. Her social accounts went quiet. The event stopped posting photographs of her. The boutique that had extended her credit began the process of recovering its assets. The penthouse was vacated. The borrowed jewelry was returned, item by item, by a courier working from an inventory list. Mateo lost the apartment he had moved into with her 2 months after they left the auction house, when the restructured debt terms he could not negotiate came due on a timeline he could not meet. He was not evicted dramatically. He was simply informed in a letter that the terms had changed and the grace period had elapsed, and he packed what he could carry and left the way people leave when there is nothing theatrical left to say. Somewhere across the city, on the morning that letter was delivered, Catalina was sitting at a desk in the Foundation's first office, her leather notebook open in front of her, and a pen moving steadily across the page. She was reviewing the agenda for a meeting with a coalition of educators from 4 countries. She was planning the language for a billion-dollar endowment agreement that her legal team had spent 2 weeks finalizing. She was reading a note her assistant had placed on the corner of the desk, a handwritten message from the first cohort of scholarship recipients, young and determined, and full of the precise kind of hunger that changes the world when it is given room to run. She signed the endowment agreement at 11 in the morning, in the clean, unhurried script of a woman who had always known how to manage what mattered. She did not pause before signing. She did not look back, not at the diner, not at the papers slid across a laminated table, not at the man who had handed her a deed to land he called worthless and walked out believing he had won something. She simply signed, set down the pen, and moved on to the next page.